Good. Okay, thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. And I'm delighted to welcome all of us to the second in our series of 5 meetings in which local citizens are talking to us about books which they think are indispensable and should have a place on every Jewish bookshelf. I'd also like to give a special welcome to, I think I can see, or I could see before I became highlighted, members of the Brazil and Topper family who've joined us this evening. You're very welcome. I'd like to also say, I'm sitting at the same table, Benjamin Brazil, as you sat at some years ago when you were a bit younger than you are now, busy fighting with your friend. But I just thought I'd like you to know that. Anyway, to tonight's business. Vivian reminds me that both of our presenters tonight are from Sunderland. Now, I remember the Sunderland Jewish community from my days in Bnei Akiva, and it was a lively, learned, knowledgeable community. I don't think that once mighty community is any longer with us in that way, but Ruth and Cyril have both brought that sort of Sunderland energy to Kenton, and they placed it at our community's disposal to great effect, I might say. Ruth will be speaking to us shortly about a book that you might consider the first great Jewish history book, The Jewish War, written by Flavius Josephus, who was also known as Rabbi Yoseph ben Mathias, and he was a Roman Jewish historian of the first century. There is a Canadian academic by the name of Steve Mason, and he has described the Jewish War as, quote unquote, perhaps the most influential non-biblical text of Western history. Well, we shall hear more about that in due course. But firstly, Cyril is going to talk to us about the Talmud, the central text of rabbinic Judaism, which also happens to share some historical periods with Josephus. Weighing in at 63 tractates and 2,711 double-sided folios, you're going to need more than a bookshelf to accommodate the Talmud. But the Talmud includes Jewish law, philosophy, ethics, customs, folklore, and a lot more besides. So, Cyril, over to you. Oops. You might need to unmute yourself, I think.
Is that better now? Hello, everybody. It's my job to talk about this enormous book, the Talmud. It's an enormous task to review, explain the origins, purpose, and history of probably the greatest literary work in Jewish history, except for the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. I must assure you, this talk is not going to be a Gemara shiur. Others better qualified than me can do that. It is about the Talmud, its origins and history, and its relevance to the present day. It is, by right, this book, and I call it a book for the moment, should never have been written. It is a text which has affected the life of all Jews throughout the ages to this very day, regardless of your branch of Judaism or level of commitment you have chosen. It is designed for every Jew as a guide for life. It is a book that has accompanied us throughout our history, through good times and bad. The Talmud itself has been attacked many, many times by our enemies, and it is a mirror of the troubles which has beset its followers, the Jewish people, who are its guardians. Its origins go back a long way, a very long way, to the beginnings of our Israelite ancestors as a nation, to the days of Moses over 3,300 years ago. So let's get started with our journey into the past on our biblical history tour. First of all, what is the Talmud? To put it simply, it is a collection of statements of Jewish law, the Mishnah, and interpretation and discussions of these principles, the Gemara, the completion, combined with customs, folk tales, stories, snippets of sciences, medicine, as it was understood at the times and taught by our rabbinical sages to their students and followers. And to complicate matters further, it is not one book but many volumes. And to complicate it even further still, there are 2 Talmuds as well. But we will come to that in due course. So the history of this Talmud, where do we start? Here we are. This is a illustration of the second temple. The obvious answer is at the beginning, but where is that? Well, it goes back a long way, a very long way indeed, to before the destruction of the second temple in 70 CE. During this time, there were several Jewish groups with their followers. The main two were the Pharisees and the Sadducees from around the year 536 until 70 CE of the Common Era. So it stretches over that period. Now here is the most fundamental principle of the Talmud. Jewish tradition believes that the time of the giving of the Torah, Matan Torah, the revelation, the Lord gave Moshe the Aseres HaDibrot, the 10 statements. We call them commandments, not really absolutely correct. And our Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash. This was what Moses wrote down and is known as the written law. To accompany the written law, the Lord transmitted instructions how to observe the written law. This was the oral law, passed on verbally from God's mouth to Moses' ear, never to be written down. Passed on from generation to generation, from memory, transferred in each generation to the memory of able, capable people. The Pharisees said without the oral law, it would be impossible to know how to carry out the commandment and organize a just society. And I'm sure we could all agree with that, that the simple laws that are mentioned in the Bible, in the Chumash, just don't give enough detail on how to carry out the mitzvot. And this slide's got a bit fuzzy. You can see for yourself the transmission of the oral law through the generation, the very first pair, chapter 1 of the Pirkei Avot. For the Pharisees, this was very, very important to show that it did come from God through Moses to all the generations. And therefore, it was really the most important part of their statement, their raison d'etre. So we've got a picture here of the second temple. How do I get to the next picture? The Sadducees, they were the opposing group, did not accept the existence of the oral law. They may have acknowledged the existence of these traditions, but did not give them the privilege of divine authority. They took a more literal review of the Torah and had their own traditions. However, the Sadducean party had most of the Kohanim, including the Kohen Gadol, as followers. It often came to an impasse when the two beliefs came into conflict. It all came to an end following the destruction of the second temple by the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era. The Sadducean party, whose very existence depended on the temple service, as most of its members were the Kohanim, disappeared from the Jewish world. Without a temple, the Jewish people felt they were lost, unable to make atonement for sins, particularly on Yom Kippur, and would be banished by the Lord and doomed. It was now up to the Pharisees, who all that was left of our faith, to save the Jews and their faith from oblivion. The Pharisees gave themselves the authority to decide the law and imposed its rules on the Jews. They claimed authority from Moses himself. The Pharisees were required to take Judaism in a direction without a temple, to intervene with God. Quite a challenge, as we are a faith of atonement and forgiveness of our sins by sacrifices and prayer in the temple by the Kohanim, and is essential for our continued existence. It was this they thought was essential. Such was the trauma of the destruction of the temple that the Pharisees went back to the law, both written and oral, to analyze it, define it, and decide every detail of observance of it. They did this by clever interpretation of the Torah, deduction, and many exegetical methods. You can see them in the Shacharit prayer, where we say the 18 different ways that the rabbis, the sages, learnt how to understand the Torah. They renewed Judaism by instituting prayers, davening instead of sacrifices, and developed the principle of studying the oral law. During this time, there was still an established community. Let me just get this slide to go back somehow. It's got big for reasons I do not know. Stop share. There we are. Now I can start share again. Here we are. Nope, it's not going. It's not going. Why isn't it sharing? Your screen sharing. Where are all my pictures gone? Here we are. Here we are, that's right, Babylon. During this time, there was still an established Jew community living in Babylon, and this is a Babylon picture, the first exile by Nebuchadnezzar, and they'd continued living in Babylon, and not too bad life it was. Both communities, both in Palestine and in Babylon, had set up communities, and they both had academies, called them yeshivot, if you wish, where senior teachers would study and expound the oral law with a large following of students. The oral law was always stored in the memories on the tongues of learned men to define all aspects of daily life. They were like human hard drives, memory banks of unwritten texts, setting out basic principles of law, jurisprudence, and religious observance. They could repeat large chunks of text at will. They were called repeaters, or as they are known by the Aramaic title, Tanaim. The statements of law, together with opposing views, were put together in short statements, which are called mishnahs, meaning second law. The word sheni is in the word mishnah. Of course, they were more than just speaking by rote, but high-powered authorities of Jewish law and opinion, and were tasked with understanding and interpreting the oral law as they understood it. Many were the Tanaim, numbering 120. Hillel and Shabai were two Tanaim. They had opposing views on many matters. Hillel was a man of the people. Remember the story about a man asking Hillel to teach him the Torah while standing on one leg, and replied, "Do not do unto others what is hateful to you, now go and study." Shammai was an elitist. To study in his academy, you had to be very intelligent, from a good family, that's family merit, and be rich, so that you would have no problems with earning a living. The work of the Tanaim and academies was taking place both in Palestine and Babylon. In Palestine, the center of the study were in Tiberias, Sepphoris, in Galilee, and Caesarea. We've probably been to Tiberias and Galilee. I don't know about Sepphoris. In Babylon, equivalent to modern Iraq today, there were 5 locations, and here they are: Nehadiah, Nisibis, Mahosa, near Baghdad, and Pumbedisa and Sura. The last two are probably the ones which are most well known. The sages in both countries were concerned with the Jewish upheavals, Jews moving long distance away, and Rome and other persecutions. The holy oral law may become confused, or even worse, forgotten. The leader at the time was Judah Hanassi, who finally edited the Mishnah and put it into logical order. So it was systematically codified into terse, short, and sometimes not so short statements of law, including different opinions put together in a logical manner. And this produced the famous Mishnah. And I think we should be able to get onto the next slide. That is another view of old Babylon. There we are. There's a book of the Mishnah, a modern one. Those Mishnahs were not considered important enough to be included in the canon. Were called Baraisas, which mean outside in Aramaic. So we now have to know a bit about what is the Mishnah. It means second or second Torah. The understanding of the Mishnah, now complete, was far from easy. It used archaic terms, inconsistencies, and usually came to no conclusions. It was ripe for others to interpret it. So both in Palestine and Babylon, academies were established to do that very job. The sages who undertook this task were called Amorim, from the Hebrew Aramaic Emor, which means to say, and they were talkers, speakers. The Amorim were the next level in the strict hierarchy of authority. So no Amora could ever challenge a Tana. It was just not acceptable. So if there was a difference of opinion, you had to find some way of sorting it out without altering the opinion of the Tana. They could not argue with an opinion of a Tana, and so spent much time and efforts into ironing out contradictions. Different opinions and traditions were many. The period of the Amorim lasted from the year 200 to 450 CE in the Common Era, so the 1st century. This was time of the formulation of the Talmud as we know it, still done orally and preserved in the memory banks of the Amorim. During times of persecution and a movement of populations, again, this was a risky way to preserve the oral law. Eventually, the leader of the Babylonian community decided it was time to edit it, put the text into logical order, and finally put quill to parchment and preserve the Talmud for posterity. And that was the completion of the text of the Gemara. It's called Gemara, which means completion. And it took place in 2 centers of Jewish scholarship, Galilee and Babylon. Correspondingly, 2 bodies of analysis developed and 2 works were created. One was called the Jerusalem Talmud, but that's erroneous. It was really more in Palestine. It was compiled in the 4th century in Galilee. The Babylonian Talmud compiled over 300 years later and completed about the year 500, although it continued to be edited later. The word Talmud, when used without qualification, usually means the Babylonian Talmud. And it was finished by 2 Amorim in the year 475, and they were Ravina and Rav Ashi. You can tell stories about all of these sages, but not for today. So what does it consist of? The Babylonian Talmud consists of 38 separate volumes divided into 6 orders or sections of related or not so related subject matter, which is further divided into 63 sections called tractates, which are then broken into 517 chapters. This then constitutes 2,711 pages, each one called a daf, which has 2 sides. If that's not enough, there are 2 Talmuds. And the one we're talking about is the Babylonian Talmud. I think I've missed some slides here. What have we got? There we are. Some ancient, I think, handwritten, probably on parchment. There is a modern selection of the Talmud Babli of all the volumes together, but no translation in this one. We'll come to that in a minute. The Talmud commentaries, slide 6. Well, I hope that's slide 6, yes. We must remember that the Talmud text is written in Aramaic, the lingua franca of Babylon and Palestine, without vowels or punctuation and in a unique script. Although the purpose of the Gemara is to explain and interpret the Mishnah, the Gemara itself is dense and needs interpretation, sometimes deciphering. Just trying to work out what the Gemara is saying is a challenge. So many commentaries have been produced to try and illuminate the text. The first group of commentators are called the first ones, or the Rishonim, from the 10th to the 14th century, over a long period of time, and includes Rashi. No page of Gemara is complete without 2 of the most famous commentaries. On the right side is Rashi, who gives a running explanation, short and to the point on virtually every phase or sentence. So as you plow through the Gemara, there's always Rashi to tell you what it means. And that's written in Rashi's own script as well. So it's a different kind of writing again. It gets harder and harder. On the other side of the page is Tosafot, which means additional comments written over a period from the 12th to the 15th century. And these were a whole different number of sages. Tosafots were mostly living in France and Germany. 2 of them, Rabbi Yaakov Orleans in France, who died a martyr's death in London in 1189, and Rabbi Yom Tov ben Yitzchak, who was murdered in the city of York in 1190. We have the next group of commentators called the after ones, the later ones, or Achronim, and they live from the 16th century, and there are still around today people who comment on it, so they're all Achronim. You will find each of their commentaries in the back of the Talmud tractate in very small print. It's heavy work. Each volume is therefore large. Usually these sections are studied, the commentaries in the back in yeshivot. It's time consuming. You even get commentaries on commentaries. You could spend whole your life studying the Talmud, and many pious Jews do so. There we are. So we're going to go up to, that's going to be the next. The next section I'm going to talk about is the burning of the Talmud. We had lots of enemies, and it was very strange how it happened. Centers of Talmud study in areas of Mesopotamia were on trade routes, and centers of business activity and Islamic study helped the spread of the Talmud beyond its Middle Eastern home. It reached the Rhineland and France. These were not Islamic areas. And in the Maghreb in Spain. Islamic faith and study of the Quran had great similarity with Talmud study, and their principles of law were often developed in tandem. We have the Talmud. Islam has the Hadith. We have Teshuvot, which are rabbinic replies to questions of law and faith, and they have fatwas. Academics call them today responsa. We have the Halakha, the way. Islam has Sharia, which means the clear, well-trodden path. Nothing like the meaning of Halakha. To varying degrees, Jews lived satisfactorily in Muslim countries. They had many similar outlooks on life. However, when Jews started to form communities in Christian countries, problems arose. Christian society, mostly Catholic, had little knowledge of understanding Jews, their belief and practices. The church tolerated Jews as a requirement of their faith, as an example of how there were three things that the Catholics thought about us Jews, why they allowed us to be there. The first one was that keeping Jews in proximity showed the world and other people how much superior Christianity was to Judaism. So they needed the Jews. The second reason was that the Jews were, one of their tenets of their faith was to convert Jews. It was an important act for them to do it, therefore they had to have some Jews to convert. And the third one was, well, they had a certain respect for Jewish practice. When all said and done, it was in their Bible, the Old Testament, we call it the Hebrew Bible, and their Old Testament, and these were ancient laws with that Jesus observed them himself. So they felt that it wasn't completely alien to the Catholic faith that Jews were observing ancient Bible law. However, what they didn't know was that we weren't really observing ancient Bible law. We were, in fact, observing the oral law. Let me get back to my script. Christian society, that's right, I explained the three different reasons. This was brought, so they were completely unknown to them about our oral law and the Talmud, and biblical Jews were outlined. And this was brought to the attention of Pope Gregory X by a chap called Nicholas Donin, who was an apostate Jew, possibly a Karaite, in 1236. He informed the church of 35 charges against the Talmud, including passages that made less than flattering comments about the Christian Messiah. However, as we know, Jews had the oral law as interpreted in the Talmud to live a Jewish life. From the perspective of the Catholic Church, rabbinic Judaism was definitely not the biblical Judaism as they understood it, not what they had signed up for when they let the Jews in. The rabbis, they claimed, were the authors of this Talmudic hoax, and it would not be tolerated. On March the 3rd, 1240, the first Shabbat, or the first Saturday of Lent, while the Jews were in synagogue, the Pope ordered the confiscation, and the king ordered the burning of the Talmud. Similar instructions were passed to England, Spain, and Portugal. Strangely, in all this, the Jews were not squeaky clean themselves. A certain group of learned Jews had major philosophical issues with the book by Maimonides called Marinavarchim. He actually appreciated Aristotle's principles, and they did not at all. If you want to know more Aristotle principles, that's another talk. And they were so incensed that they persuaded non-Jewish authorities to burn the copies of the Marinavarchim, all Maimonides' works. And it gave the authorities an opportunity to have a look at other Jewish texts on the list that was included in the Talmud. So we didn't do ourselves any favor. An inquisitorial committee condemned the Talmud to 2 years later, in June in 1242 in Paris. 24 wagon loads of handwritten copies of the Talmud, written meticulously on parchment and vellum, toting thousands of volumes, were handed to the executioner. Yes, they used an executioner for public burning. Similar burnings took place in Rome, and of course, with the burning of our holy text, much anti-Semitic activity followed. One of the trials of our Talmud. We must move on. The Talmud was around, and with the invention of the printing press of Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, a new era for the Talmud commenced. No longer was the Talmud laboriously copied by hand. Yes, I should have shown you a picture. There we are. This is of the burning of the Talmud. It's a sketch, probably of Christian origin, but it shows what they did. Yes. No longer was the Talmud laboriously copied by hand with quill and ink onto parchment or early paper, but whole pages, all identically rolled off the presses. Daniel Bomberg, born around 1483 in Antwerp, with a name like that, he should have been a Jew, but was actually a Christian. Yes, Daniel Bomberg was a printer in Venice. A certain Felix Pratensis, an Augustan friar who had converted from Judaism, is said to encourage Bomberg to print Hebrew books. And he managed to print a complete Babylonian Talmud between 1519 and 1523. So now we're getting down to real, actual books. The first ever Talmud printing was by Joshua Solomon Sonsino, who's still around today, the Sonsino book, who printed the first individual tractates in 1483 with the style which we are familiar today. The project was overseen by Rabbi Chaya ben David, a Rosh Yeshiva and Dayan. However, the Sonsino edition actually came before this first edition by Daniel Bomberg, but it only managed to do, I think, just a few copies of a few of the sections of Talmud. So the Bomberg printing in Venice was the real first full Talmud Bavli. That edition is considered highly accurate even to this day. Pope Paul III attempted to censure the text of anti-Christian statements, but Bomberg forcefully argued that the text should not be altered, and he won his battle then in 53. But in 1553, the church was up to its old tricks, and the Talmud was once again being burned in Italy, and they were trying to censor it. Some things never change. A little story: the Talmud, Book of Kings. There's a printed Talmud, the kind we have today. If you know who that is, it's Henry VIII. In 1527, King Henry VIII was desperate to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So when the Catholic advisors denied him annulment, Henry knew that the Jews had something in their Talmud, in their Bible, which allowed people to annul marriages or marry a second time in certain circumstances. So he sent messages to the Jewish community of Italy, hoping that a little money with a bit of bribe might win them over to his side. He would have asked the Jews in England, but if his predecessor, King Edward, hadn't expelled them in 1290. Henry figured that the Jews, what the Jews would tell him was solid enough biblical grounding for him to persuade the Archbishop, and he ordered a complete copy of the Talmud for England, hoping it would help his case. Henry's messengers managed to find a few rabbis, and they accepted some bribes, and they tried to tell him that yes, under certain circumstances, if the husband of your brother doesn't have any children, he can marry the widow and produce children. But if he has children, you mustn't marry her at all. But then they only applied to Gentiles, didn't apply to Gentiles anyway. So whether any of this in the Talmud was going to help Henry was very debatable. Anyway, he decided it was a waste of time, and he just formed his new church. But this copy of the Talmud remained in Westminster Abbey till modern times, and a certain Jack Victor Lunzer of Golders Green, no less, who must have been a wealthy man, established the Valdemosa Jewish Library Trust, after many attempts, eventually purchased the Talmud with various interesting offers to the church, and eventually it was sold for $9.3 million. Yeah, not bad. Now, why isn't the slide changing? There we are. This is a text of one of the very first printings of the Bomberg edition. It looks a bit different. I've never seen anything like this before, but that's what it looked like then. We're going to another something now. Generally, Bible's Gemara study, Talmud study has been restricted to men. It's been restricted in the yeshivot. It has been only studied there, and generally it has been not made very public to anybody. However, women are now studying Talmud. Women have traditionally been excluded from Talmud learning. Throughout the ages, they have assumed the mantle of learning, studying the development of the law from the first century of the common era. They said women did not have the mind for it. And anyway, they had the children and the home to look after. I remember people saying to me that women have got the cup. What a load of rubbish. How patronizing. There are now seminaries in the United States and Israel where women study Gemara to the same depth as men. The Talmud has been emancipated. Times have changed. Women study the Talmud the world over. I think I've got some. There we got a modern edition. In our Jews College now, the London School of Jewish Studies, Rabbi Dr. Irving Jacobs, the principal who established a BA course in Jewish Studies, both women and men joined the course. He made it a requirement that all participants follow the same curriculum, including Talmudic studies. He told me that women were the best students. Our regular Wednesday night cheer in Kenton has several ladies on it. We study via Zoom, but I'm certain women will be attending this year in person in due course. We now come to the Renaissance of the Talmud. In the early days, the Talmud had restricted readership, handwritten or parchment, rare and expensive. Difficult text and language, major barriers to its study, except for serious scholars in academies and yeshivas. In modern times, we have, of course, multitude of printed text, and we have wonderful English translation, and here is one of our very best. This is the Schotterstein, or the Art Scroll. The first, which I have a complete set, is the Sonsino edition. I've got in my bookshelf. Its a translation is mostly literal, and as the Aramaic text is brief and short with no explanation, the English is not much better. And the footnotes are pretty useless as well. Then came an Art Scroll, a New York-based high-end graphic studio established by Rabbi Meir Zlotowitz in 1975, and he was a graphic designer, and he designed this wonderful Art Scroll, and it has the full Vilna Shas. I'll mention the Vilna Shas later on, and with all the traditional page, and the Aramaic and the Hebrew text is written in regular Hebrew with vowels in short, complete phrases, and then fully translated into modern English and filling in the missing words to fully understand the meaning. Further commentaries below explain the context and background of the topic. Anyone who has reasonable intelligence, whether they have a deep understanding of Gemara or not, if they put their mind to it, can understand the subject. It has emancipated our Talmud. With the release of Art Scroll editions, everyone with an interest in Jewish study can learn. Talmud used to belong solely to the world of the yeshiva, guarded by its rabbinim and talmidim using Gemara Lashon, that's jargon, only they understood. With Art Scroll, anyone could dip in. Yeshiva Bachrim, Jews of every kind, men, women, reform, liberal, but with the extra English words to make the translation understandable, a few lines of Gemara text takes 4 times the space of the original text. So one page of Gemara takes a whole page of English translation with commentary. As a consequence, the one page of original Gemara requires 3 pages of translation. To keep the Gemara text side by side with the translation, then each Gemara page requires 3 actual pages of side-by-side English translation. So a single tractate volume now expands to 3 volumes. I hope you're still with me. The Schotterstein Art Scroll edition, completed in 2004, comprises, wait for it, 73 volumes for the entire Talmud. 73. Most students will buy just 1 volume. They are studying. It is also available online to download at a page at a time. Our shul can photocopy the odd page when needed. I must have mentioned an incredible, great teacher. There we are. There is one of the pages of the Art Scroll with on this side is the Hebrew, the Aramaic. Here is the text, but you've got to turn over page after page because that little line there represents all that page of text. So that line there, from there to there, was a whole page. That's 1 page, and that'll be the 3rd page. Yes, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, a charismatic rabbi and teacher who transformed the whole of translated the whole of the Shas into Hebrew and then English. It is styled quite differently to the Art Scroll, and it made comprehension of the Talmud easy for all Jews. There's my Sonsino, and there is a page of, well, the Steinsaltz. Aha. Daf Yomi, daily page of Gemara. In 1923, Agudas Israel in Poland and under Rabbi Shapiro started the Daf Yomi, a page-a-day Gemara movement. All interested Jews from all backgrounds, men and women, would learn the same page every day for about an hour. This, he said, would unite all Jews around the world. The whole cycle of studying all 2,711 pages takes 7 years, 5 months. At the end of completion, the party is called a Siyum party, and it's celebrated throughout the world. And you can study in group with a shiur, a chaver, a partner, on the phone, internet, and mobile app. We're coming to the end, don't worry. Let's see where the next, yes. And there we have a Gemara shiur with ladies. This was a Daf Yomi Siyum held in Wembley Arena around the corner in 2020. A lot of men there, look at them all, but not one lady. But don't worry, that's the ladies' one in Jerusalem, where, well, probably as many men, if not as many as the men, if not more, for the ladies' Daf Yomi. And here we have a little clip. Is it going to work? Is it go? No. What a shame. I can't get the clip to work. Sorry, folks. It should work. It was going to be on my best bit. But there we are. So why study Gemara? The Talmud is the backbone of our Jewish life. For those Jews who believe the Talmud is the direct word of God and its decision when it makes one, it doesn't always come to decisions at Gemara. It leaves it for people called poskim, who are deciders, who will then decide what the actual law should be based on what the arguments in the Gemara have been, and it can be written down in one of the books that we've already had a lecture on called the Shulchan Aruch. So you don't always get the final answer from the Gemara. For those who take it differently, it tells us how to behave, what are our laws. It tells us stories and folklore of the past, which is what we do today. Its logic, svara, its arguments, its intellectual challenges sharpen the mind. Studying with a chaver, a friend or a shir, or a one-to-one, something like an aish or even seeds, is a social activity, as much intellectual as social. In the religious world, knowledge of our Torah law and the oral law is a religious duty akin to prayer. Jews for centuries have made study of the Talmud one of the highest obligations for a religious male Jew. We studied the Talmud not to become rabbis, not to become Jewish lawyers, but just to know and understand the law, whether it is about compensation for your ox goring another person, or it could be your car going out of control, or what to do if you find a lost object, which is what the very first Mishnah I learned. There we are. We have a Kenton Shul Library there. So you learn Gemara, you learn Talmud for its own sake, just for learning it, and that is called Lishma, just to study God's law for no other reason than it's our duty to be knowledgeable. However, many yeshivas teach their students an almost total diet of Talmud to the exclusion of Gemara, Tanakh, and Jewish history, but there are many yeshivas which take a more broader outlook. My own introduction to Gemara was when I was a little boy of 9, in the very room in the picture that is the shul I belong to, the Son of Beta Medrash. Just look at this, for instance. There is our Schotterstein art scroll, goes from here. It's about 8-10 feet of library space. You probably couldn't have this on your normal bookshelf. Anyway, I started learning Gemara as a 9-year-old boy. I wasn't taught any lectures or anything about it, just told to learn the text with our Rebbe, Rini. The room I learned it in, this is the very room I studied it years ago. These Gemaras, 17th century texts, 18th century, when we used to look to find if we could find the oldest one there. So if you fancy investing in a set of the Talmud, it's quite an undertaking. It may not be everybody's bedtime reading, but it is an essential book for every synagogue library. And in Kenton, we have various sets. Yes, we've got... There we are. We've got, there's a complete set. There's a regular one with no translation. There's the art scroll all the way along. Enormous. As I've said, a complete art scroll set consists of 73 volumes. It takes up 12 feet of shelf space. I've measured it in the library in the Canonic room, and will set you back £2,433.99 from Layman's Jewish booksellers of Gateshead. He had a lucky time many years ago, and he got the contract for all Art Scroll books. And Art Scroll was only a very small publisher then, and he got it for all of Europe. He may give you a discount on the 99 pence if you pay him in cash. I'm not sure about that. Perhaps not for everyone, but a single volume is about £35. Attending a shiur and going through all the text may take you a year or two, so it's affordable. You're going to use it for quite a long time, and you may have a good seeing party at the end. If I've whetted your appetite, come and join us every Wednesday evening. As the Gemara says, Tor Shema, come and hear and find out what the Yeshivalite are asking. If you want to know what the Yeshivalite is, you'll have to join us. And my friends, that is the end for tonight. Thank you for listening.
Can we you stop screen sharing?
Yes.
And we'll see if anybody's got any questions. Okay. Am I muted? No, I'm not. Okay, right. Anybody? Thank you, Cyril. It's difficult to talk about the Talmud in 30 minutes. and you didn't. But pretty good. Never mind about that. Thank you so much. Anybody got any comments or questions? No. You do need, despite what Cyril says, you really do need to have a Gemara Kopf, it's called in English, in order to study Talmud. I have great difficulty with it. I must say there are bits of it I find very, very, very challenging. But that's my fault and not the Gemara's fault.
It may be that you don't agree with the text, not that you can't study it.
I just don't get it. But I say that's my weakness and not the Gemara's. Okay. Anybody have any? I can't see the whole screen, so let me just see if I can see the whole screen, because I've got the whole screen. Can so if anybody wants, there we go. Right. Anybody got any questions or comments, or, as we might say, additions, tosafot to make? Irene, yes, please. Irene, we should play before she goes on. Here is a woman who has been studying Talmud.
Yeah. Cyril, that was excellent. It was an amazing overview of the whole thing. I just wanted to comment that quite often when boys go to Israel on a year off, or however many years they may go to yeshiva, when they come back, very often at the university they say that they're able to be, amazing students, and it's because of the logical way that Gemara is learned, I think. And the other comment I wanted to say was that amongst some communities...
Irene, can I just stop you for a second? Somebody, could you please...
That is going to be devastating to her.
Somebody mute the telly or whatever it is, please. Okay, go on, just sorry.
Yeah, no, the other comment I wanted to make was often a bridegroom would be given a set of shas at his engagement. So as you said, it's a tidy price, but it's an investment for life, for their learning. So I wanted to say.
As long as it be quite a few well-thumbed pages.
I might say, for people on the call who are educated to A-level standards and degree standard and above, Talmud is a lot more challenging than any of that stuff, believe me. Okay, any further comments or any additions? Nope. Okay, we'll move on. Ruth, your time has come, but you're going to have to unmute yourself, I think. Trouble to go to all that trouble and then not speak to all of us. Okay, off you go.
Right, thank you. You see me?
Yeah.
You've got it. Right. Okay, today I'm going to talk on Josephus's book, Jewish War. Now, you may ask, why choose this book? Well, I heard about Josephus as the turncoat who wrote about Masada. He was seen very suspect, as apparently he was on Rome's side, a man who was alive during events of great significance for us. I read the first part of the Jewish War for a course, and I was plunged into events as they unfolded almost 2,000 years ago. They were both fascinating and disturbing. Joseph's description of the beauty of the temple was awe-inspiring. His account of the destruction was devastating, and I felt as though I'd been given a ringside seat. But who was he? Well, this is a picture of Josephus. That's a fanciful picture, and that's actually from a Roman bust from 1st century CE. Right. Josephus was a Jewish nobleman. He was descended from the Hasmoneans with a great-great-grandmother as a princess, and his father came from a priestly family. Born in 37 CE, he was raised in Jerusalem. He was a precocious child, and when a teenager, explored the teachings of the Sadducees, the Essenes, even spent some time in the desert with an ascetic, Bannus, before settling on his life, living it as a Pharisee. He adhered to Judaism all his life, and he emphasized this in his later writings. As a young adult, he was involved with the intricate policies of Jerusalem, where there are numerous factions jockeying for position. By his mid-20s, he was sufficiently well thought of by the ruling body to be sent on a mission to Rome to plead on behalf of some priests who'd been sent there as prisoners. Josephus returned to Jerusalem in spring 66 CE when war broke out, and he was appointed as a general in charge of the Gallilee campaign. According to his account in the Jewish War, he used tactics learned from Rome to instill efficiency and discipline into his large army. Despite this, the result was failure, and eventually he was taken captive at Judea, which changed the course of his life. When Judea fell, the surviving soldiers scrambled to find places to hide. Josephus found a cave where about 40 others were hiding. They only had enough food for a few days, and whilst he was prepared to be taken prisoner, his comrades preferred to die. Josephus argued against dying, and as he writes, "At that critical moment, all this came clear to him in a flash of inspiration, and drawing further on the terrifying images of his recent dreams, he offered up a prayer to God under his breath. Since it is your will, he prayed, to bring to its knees the Jewish nation which you created. Since all good fortune has now passed over to the Romans, and since you have singled out my spirit to foretell what is to come, I now choose to surrender myself to the Romans and to live. But I call you witness that I go, not as a traitor, but as your servant." His fellows would have none of this, and so he made a suicide pact with them. He suggested that they draw lots, kill each other, and the last man was to fall on his sword. Fortune favoured Josephus because he drew a lot, leaving him as one of the last men standing. Believing he was divinely inspired not to die ignominiously in the cave, he persuaded the one comrade left that rather than die, they should surrender. He was a prominent prisoner, and the Romans came to gawk at the man who had waged such a difficult campaign against them. And while some were baying for his execution, others relented at the sight of this man who had been such a thorn in their side. And Josephus wrote, Titus in particular was powerfully affected by Josephus's resolute bearing in adversity and by pity for his youth. Now, such a prominent prisoner would normally have been sent straight to Rome to the emperor, to Nero. To prevent this, Josephus requested an audience with Vespasian, where he told him of a prophecy that had come to him whilst in the cave. You, Vespasian, will, as Josephus wrote, you, Vespasian, will be Caesar and emperor, both you and your son, here with us. So chain me tighter now and keep me for yourself, as you, Caesar, are master not only of me, but of all land and sea and the whole human race. Punish me, please, with yet harsher confinement, if I am taking the name of God in vain. Now, this prophecy was recounted by Suetonius in his biography of Vespasian, and it also ensured that Josephus was released from captivity and he became part of Vespasian and Titus's entourage. He now witnessed events from the Roman side, and he was used to try and entreat his fellow Jews to surrender and to rely on Titus's mercy. But this was to no avail. Following Jerusalem's fall, all he managed to do was to save a few of his former comrades from crucifixion, and he saved a large number of books. Vespasian then took Josephus to Rome. He gave him one of his houses and enough land to have a regular income. Josephus became a Roman citizen. He lived on the fringes of the court, and he became a historian. He never returned to Judea. Now, the role of historians in classical times was different from today. Whilst they recorded history, it was usually the voice of privilege. They put their own spin on what happened or what they felt should have happened. Their truth may not have been exactly as events played out. Speeches are what the historian felt should have been said, rather than what had been said. Words may be put into someone's mouth to explain the events of the time. Writing also had to show favour to current rulers, and whilst there could be subtle influences of criticism, it had to be very muted. The Jewish War, Oxford translation, is no different. It owes a lot to Greek historiography, as well as having motifs in the book that only Jewish readers would have understood. Such ones as appeal to biblical precedents, and they figured in the speech Josephus put into his own mouth when addressing the Jewish army, as he stood with the Roman army outside the walls of Jerusalem. Simkovich, a historian, believes that Josephus's aim in writing the Jewish War was to retell Jewish history in a way that presented the Jews as members of an admirable religion whose values paralleled those of Greece and Rome. Josephus's writings provide important evidence regarding Jewish life in the Second Temple period. However, you've got to get beyond the writing. In the Jewish War, he portrays himself as a brilliant scholar, as well as a skilled general. In later works, one on his life, he suggested that he was only a novice and had been sent to the Galilee as a representative of the Jewish leaders who wanted him to keep peace there. When writing the Jewish War, he intended to show it to the Flavians and presented them with a copy. Josephus claimed in the book on his life that Titus had believed that the Jewish War should be considered the only authentic description of the war, and he had not only signed the books, but given orders for publication. Consequently, Josephus needed to portray himself in it as a skilled general. The defeat in Galilee had to reflect well on Roman warfare, whilst trying to show that he himself wasn't responsible for its failure. And Schiffner also believed that he wanted to show the Romans the war had been brought about by a minority of the Jews and had not reflected the attitude of the people at large. And history is usually written by the victors. You rarely hear the other side. Now, nowadays, people look for stories of the silent witnesses, the poor and the defeated, through interpretation of the sources and physical artifacts found in the archaeological digs. Now, though we put our spin on what is found, it's really difficult to appreciate the attitudes and the biases of changing sides. In his introductory preface to the Jewish War, he makes it clear that he wants to put the record straight. As he stated, that the historians either put together a conglomerate collection of hearsay, inconsistent stories, or were participants who would distort the facts, either to vilify the Jews who they hate or glorify themselves. And as he wrote, I have taken it on myself to publish to the inhabitants of the Roman Empire a Greek translation of the factual account which I had earlier written in my native language and circulated to the non-Greek speakers in the interior. I am Josephus, son of Mathias, a Hebrew by race, a native of Jerusalem, and a priest. I myself fought against the Romans in the early stages of the war and had no choice but to witness the later events. Now, orators could put messages in their writings, and if they weren't too blunt, they would be acceptable. Much of the Jewish war ran counter to the messages from Vespasian and Titus, as Josephus, although he praised their tactics and their heroism, he maintained that the victory was through the aid of God. So the Jewish war is a work of Roman literature, as well as the work of a man with a learned Jewish education. He never denied his Judaism at a time when it was difficult to be Jewish. What changes? He even went against the general trends of the time. Rather than attributing the victory of Vespasian and Titus over the Jews just their prowess in war, he attributed it to the work of Hashem to punish the Jews for their sins. He wrote several books, of which the Jewish War was the first. The others were Jewish Antiquities, which detail the history of the Jews from creation to the outbreak of the war in 66 CE. The Life of Flavius Josephus, which was almost an addendum to Jewish Antiquities, and it was followed shortly before he died by Against Appian. In Against Appian, he defined himself very much as a Jew, and whilst in his other books he wrote about himself in the third person, as you may have noticed, in Against Appian, he often wrote in the first person. Now, one problem people did have with Josephus' writings were the contradictions of his accounts of the Jewish war compared to the accounts of the same things in his life and beyond Appian. It is possible that when writing the later books, he had access to other accounts of the war. Although it doesn't change his account of himself as a skilled general in Jewish war, and his description of himself as a novice in the life. It may well be that his memory was different when he was older, or the political climate was such that he could write what he felt was the truth later on. Now, the contradictions made some scholars doubt his work. However, some of his descriptions of the landscape and topography correspond very well to the same places today, and that does add veracity to his works. His description of Sodom is very similar to that of Tacitus, who wrote his histories about 109 CE. Josephus wrote, "You can still see traces of the fire from heaven and the faint outlines of 5 cities, and the ashes still permeate the crops. The fruit looks edible on the outside, but when you pick it, it collapses into smoke and dust in your hand. So the legends about Sodom, to that extent, confirmed by what we can actually see." Tacitus wrote similarly, "The plants, whether wild or artificially cultivated, or black and sterile, and wither into dust and ashes, whether in leaf or flower, or when they have attained their full growth." And he said, without denying that at some date famous cities were burnt up by fire from heaven, "I'm yet inclined to think that it is the exhalation from the lake which infect the soils and poisons the surrounding atmosphere." The Jewish War is an account of the great revolt of Judea against Rome. It is comprised of 7 books. The first book relates early history from the revolt of the Mathias against Antiochus through to the revolt against the Romans in 66 CE. He describes the Essenes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, and this is followed by detailed descriptions of various campaigns, including the subjugation of the Gallilee, of which he had been the rebel commander, to the fall of Jerusalem and the burning of the temple. The Jewish War's final book, the 7th book, may have been added later after Titus' death, when Domitian became emperor. Domitian is more noticeable in this section, and this includes a description of the Flavius triumphal procession in June 71 CE. This description, the fullest eyewitness description of any Roman triumph, differs from the rest of the Jewish War as it has a consistently Roman viewpoint. The triumph set the tone of the Flavian dynasty until its demise with the death of Domitian, as well as the relations of Rome to the Jews for the rest of antiquity. And this is from the Arch of Titus. You can see a picture, of the procession of the Flavian triumph. And Josephus wrote, "Most of the spoils were carried along in a miscellaneous mass, but special prominence was given to those captured in the temple at Jerusalem. These were a gold table, many talents in weight, and a lampstand also made of solid gold, but shaped differently from those we use in ordinary life. Fixed to the base was a central column from which slender branches extended, rather like the prongs of a trident, with a lamp holder welded at the tip of each branch. There were 7 of these lamps, reflecting the particular importance of that member to the Jews. After these, and carried last in the parade of spoils, was the Jewish law. The candelabra and the incense shovels and other paraphernalia of the Jerusalem temple were the most prominent spoils of victory exhibited, and these would have delighted spectators. The Torah scroll, included at the end, symbolically demonstrated that the conquest celebrated was of Rome over Judaism, not just Judea. Book 7 concludes with Masada's 4, which was not witnessed by Josephus and must have been gleaned from official reports and possible eyewitnesses. The reception of the Jewish war has differed throughout history. It is fascinating to see how it's fared over time. Josephus presented a copy to the emperor, and that was possibly kept in the Temple of Peace, but it may not have been read by the Romans. Josephus said that he wrote it in his native language, and this was probably Aramaic, but he rewrote it in Greek. This was because Greek was used by both Jews and Romans as the language of literature and intellectual discourse. Despite this, by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it was hardly read by Greeks, Romans, or Jews. And Josephus was remembered more by people like Tacitus and Suetonius for the prophecy he gave Vespasian, rather than his histories being cited. However, interestingly enough, the Jewish war became part of the Christian canon. It was actually used by the early church to validate Jesus' prophecies that the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed. Many earlier Christians were Jews, and they needed to carve out an identity for themselves within their new religion. And Martin Goodman believed that they needed to answer the problem of why Hashem had allowed the temple to be destroyed. Advocating that Hashem punished the Jews for their sins was a perfect explanation. And that things changed over time. Both Eusebius and Origen, early Christian scholars, blamed the fall of Jerusalem due to the plot against Jesus. By the 5th century, it was cited as an account of the punishment of the Jews for killing Jesus and was used to justify anti-Semitism. Some horrific stories about the fall of Jerusalem could even have been used to justify anti-Semitic themes of Jews killing children at Pesach and drinking their blood, the blood sacrifice. Josephus would have been horrified to learn of the reinterpretation of his work. But that's as it was. And as far as Jews went, they ignored or were ignorant of this book. And whilst there is a lot in the Jewish literature about the Great Revolution, about the fall of the temple, it's in the Talmud. Josephus is ignored. And the Mishnah, as we've heard, compiled by the 3rd century, tells all sorts of stories. In particular, one of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who lived at the time of the fall of Jerusalem. Now, he was supposed to have prophesied that Vespasian would become emperor. He was allowed to set up an academy in Yavne. And his story has some parallels to that of Josephus when he surrendered at Jotapata. As time went on, in the Middle Ages, a version of the Jewish war, Yoseph, began to circulate amongst Jewish scholars, and it was quoted by Rashi in the 11th century. Now, according to Goodman, this book was used in debates with Christians on the correct interpretation of the exile and the destruction of the temple. Passages from Yoseph even made their way into some of the Tisha B'Av Kinot. Now, the Christian world considered Josephus so important, and so many manuscripts were transcribed. There are 7 surviving Byzantine manuscripts dated from the 10th to the 12th centuries, more than survive of Thucydides or Herodotus, both renowned classical historians. The first printed edition of the Jewish War was in 1544. in Greek in Basel by the Froben press. And once Josephus was printed, it put him in the mainstream of humanist scholarship. And acceptance of his writings varied at different stages in history, depending on the political milieu of the time. The religious wars in France and the Netherlands in the second half of the 16th century led to increasing popularity as they were used to show parallels between the wars of religion and the internecine battles in Jerusalem described by Josephus. The Jewish War was read on Good Fridays in Leipzig and provided material for Jacobean playwrights and plays such as Titus and Vespasian and Elizabeth Cary's Tragedy of Marianne. He was referred to by Thomas Hardy in The Mayor of Casterbridge, Kipling in Captain Courageous, and by Mark Twain. And Whiston's translation of Josephus was the inspiration for Lew Wallace's Ben-Hur. Amongst Jewish people, initially in more modern times, Josephus's reputation was high. In the 18th century, Against Appian was one of the most popular of his works because it defended Jewish customs and depicted the Jewish constitution as the perfect theocracy. However, as time went on, people began to question his integrity. And many people, especially Jewish scholars, felt whilst he was a renowned classical scholar, they found it difficult to approve of his apparently changing sides. In 1838, disgust was expressed by Shalom HaKohen in Koreh HaDarot, a history book. He believed Josephus put personal interests above those of his compatriots. Hertz Ben Pinchas, writing in the JC, wrote, Jotapata fell because amongst the myriads of Jewish warriors, there was one who preferred an ignominious life to a glorious death. And so it went on. Debates raged with views on both sides. Woodman believed that some of his admirers felt that his ability to claim prominence, both in the Jewish and wider Gentile world, was actually a positive attribute of Josephus. And as mentioned previously, one of the biggest problems people had was in reconciling the description of the Gallilee campaign in the Jewish war and that in his life, in the life of Josephus. In England, again, the JC, this debate was prominent there, and it even sold copies of Josephus' writings. In the 19th century, people used the Jewish war as a source to establish the rights of Jews to be considered a people like any other, whose origins could be traced back to classical antiquity. Both Orthodox and Reform circles valued it as a resource, including the Hafetz Chaim, Isaac Halevi, and Zev Yavetz. Halevi felt that Josephus' work were of great value for the Orthodox world, and quoting him, he said, "Thousands of years passed over the works of Josephus, with hardly a person in Israel having read them, and the reticence shown towards them by all the sages of diaspora has been to the great detriment of the historiography of Israel. Since the scholars of Israel have returned to study these works, the times of the Second Temple period are much more clearly understood. Later on, when the Jews of Europe plunged into turmoil, the moral issues raised by Josephus, those political choices, were continually aired. Mock trials condemning him as a collaborator were quite common among Zionist youth groups in the mid-20th century. But I think to really appreciate Josephus' writings, the debate about whether he should or should have not have done as he did need to be put aside. And then we can appreciate the writings for themselves as a historical account of what happened almost 2,000 years ago in Eretz Yisrael. There are different descriptions of the temple, both Solomon's and the Second Temple. They're found in the Tanakh, the Mishnah, the Temple Scroll, found in Quran, and in Josephus' writings in Antiquities 8 and 15, and in the Jewish War, Book 5. In the Jewish War, Josephus describes Herod's temple as he saw it whereas the description in the Mishnaic tractate Midot is very much a blueprint. So when the temple is rebuilt, it can be rebuilt as accurately as possible. The measurements it gives are slightly different from that of Josephus and the temple scroll. It is based on the memory of sages who probably saw the temple and gave an oral description to their disciples. This would have included Rabbi Eliezer ben Jacob, a Tanna, who lived during the 1st century CE, and he would have seen it before the destruction. And it is thought he may have learned about the inner parts of the temple from his uncle who served in it. Rabbi Judah Hanassi contributed to its writing, included traditions of other authorities, which are also included in the Babylonian tractate Yoma and the Jerusalem tractate Yoma. Whilst the Mishnah enables us to visualize the layout of the temple, Josephus helps us to see it. And here's from the Holy Land Hotel, the model. I think it's in the Jerusalem Museum now. And so Josephus wrote, the exterior aspect of the sanctuary building made an absolute stunning impact, both spiritual and visual. Covered all over in massive plates of gold, as soon as the sun rose, it radiated such a fiery blaze of light that anyone necessarily facing in that direction had to avert his eyes as if from a direct glance at the sun. To foreigners on their way to the temple, it looked in the distance like a snow-clad mountain, as all not covered by gold was pure white in colour. On the roof there protruded sharp golden spikes to prevent birds perching there and fouling it. Some of the stones in the building were 68 feet long, 7.5 feet deep, and 9 feet wide. The Jewish war is full of descriptions of the infighting between factions, which was a major contribution to the fall of Jerusalem, as we always hear, baseless hatred. Josephus said, "Oh, my poor city, what did you ever suffer from the Romans compared to this? You were no longer God's place. You could not survive once you had become a cemetery filled with your own dead, and your internecine warfare had turned the sanctuary into a mass grave." And this is a picture of the fall of Jerusalem from, I think it's from the Netherlands, in a print of Josephus's The Jewish War. The descriptions of the famine that the city endured is enough to bring tears to one's eyes. Famine, there was pitifully little to eat, and you would have wept to see the stronger taking more than their share, and the weak reduced to whimpering and despair. Famine overpowers all human feelings, and decency is the main casualty. Also, wives would snatch food from their husbands, children from their parents, and most pitiable of all, mothers would take the food from the very mouths of their babies and not scruple when their dearest ones were wasting away in their arms. Everywhere the insurgents were hovering to grab anything people were eating. A shut house indicated food being consumed inside, and they would break down the doors and burst in, all but throttling the inhabitants to spit out the morsels they had in their mouths. Josephus then went on into detail about Mary, daughter of Eleazar, who killed her son and ate his body to complete the picture of the Jewish suffering. And he wrote, "The whole city was immediately filled with the news of this abomination, and everyone, picturing the tragic scene in their mind's eye, felt a shiver as they themselves had gone that far. The starving longed for death. He thought the lucky ones were those who had met their end before they had word or sight of such horrors." The description he gave of the burning of the temple is heartrending. The Romans set fire to the gates, the silver melted off, and quickly exposed the woodwork to the flames. which then spread densely and took hold of the colonnades. When the Jews saw this ring of fire, all strength of body and spirit drained out of them, and they were utterly aghast. No one made any move to beat back or extinguish the flames, and they just stood there, looking on, rigid with shock. Josephus believed that the total burning of the temple was due to God, who had long since condemned the temple to the flames. And as the years revolved, the fated day had now come, the 10th of the month of Luce, the anniversary of that historic burning of the temple by the king of Babylon. But this time the fire owed its origin and cause to the Jews' own people. Later on, he says, as the temple burned, anything found was looted, and anyone caught was killed. The slaughter was massive, no pity shown for age, no regard for rank, children, old men, laymen. Priests were killed indiscriminately, and war extended its grip to encompass people of every class and condition, no matter whether they were begging for mercy or trying to resist. As the fire spread ever further, the roar of the flames mingled with the groans of the dying. Now he goes on after this, and as I mentioned, he talks about the fall of Masada. This isn't as vivid, but it is very emotive. He was not present, and his account would have been taken from eyewitnesses and official records of the last battle of the revolution. Many will recognise the description of Masada and the description of the snake path, which I'm sure quite a lot of you may have ascended in your youth. Here is, you can't really see it, but it is actually a picture of the snake path. A rock of broad extent and considerable height, it is defined and isolated by deep ravines on every side, which from a bottom too far down to sea present precipitous cliffs that no sure-footed animal can climb, except there are two places where the rock allows a far from easy ascent. One of these tracks leads from the Dead Sea on the east, and the other an easier climb from the west. They call the eastern approach the snake, an image from its narrow width and constant windings, where anyone using this route had to proceed crabwise, transferring his weight from one foot to the other, with a fatal plunge a manifest possibility. At every point there yawns below him an abyss, frightening enough to daunt the most courageous. After nearly 3.5 miles, one reaches the summit, which is no sharp peak, it's a completely level plateau. I must admit that I'm glad when I climbed the snake path, we had railings and proper paths. Development of Masada was one of Herod's major projects, which included a luxurious palace on the western approach, below the summit walls on a lower site facing north. Now, Herod excavated in the rock many large tanks as reservoirs, and they created a water supply that was as good as that enjoyed where there is access to springs. And Josephus writes, there was also a spectacular store of provisions laid up inside, and their state of preservation. Stored here was a mass of corn ample enough to last for years, and an abundance of wine and oil, as well as pulses of every sort and piles of dates. When Eleazar and his Sicarii took the fortress by surprise, they found all these stores still fresh and just as good as new produce laid in. And yet it was nearly a century from the original provisioning of the fortress to its capture by the Romans. And the Romans also found what remained of the food stores undecayed. Josephus then details what happens within the fortress. And even though 2 old women and 5 children escaped and supposedly related what has happened, it is unlikely that it was as written. He put speeches into Eleazar, the leader's mouth, exhorting the defenders of Masada to die rather than surrender. And as the commentary in the Oxford translation suggests, these speeches provide a rhetorical contrast to the speech that condemns suicide, which Josephus claimed to have delivered himself when he surrendered at Judea. The speeches here give Josephus an opportunity to sum up the disastrous results of the revolution from a Jewish perspective, which echoes the speech Agrippa made before the war. And as always, he attributes the Roman victory to Hashem. And he said, it was not simply their military power which brought all this about, but there was a mightier cause at work, which handed them an apparent victory. Masada has been a symbol in Jewish eyes for generations. The story of the fortress that held out against the Romans for 3 years, and the mass suicide where the defenders killed themselves rather than surrender, is a tale of courage and determination. Josephus's description of the discovery by the Romans suggests that the Jews had the final victory. And he wrote, the Romans had none of the usual sense of triumph over an enemy. Instead, they could only feel a wondering admiration for the nobility of their collective decision and for the disregard of death, which so many had resolutely taken to its conclusion. The phrase, Masada shall never call again, has been a rallying cry for the new state of Israel. And for years, Israeli soldiers held their swearing-in ceremony at Masada. But nowadays, there are many questions as to whether the mass suicide happened. It isn't ruled out by archaeological evidence. Yigal Yadin, during his excavations of Masada, found plenty of arrowheads, but very few bodies of the supposedly suicidal Sicarii. The largest group found in the cave was on the southern slope. When examined, the skeletons turned out to be 14 men, 6 female, 4 children, and 1 embryo. They found pottery, wood, leather, and shekels, and bronze coins, many bearing the inscription for freedom for Zion, but not loads and loads of skeletons. These, if you can see them, are coins that were made at the time of the Jewish War, showing the Jewish sort of republic. So, reading the Jewish War was really like going back in a time machine, 2,000 years. The descriptions are incredibly vivid, they're incredibly lifelike. Whether you believe everything Josephus wrote or you agree with his politics, it doesn't really matter. It was an incredibly interesting book. I used quite a few books to help me in this talk. One I showed you was the translation by Martin Hammond of the Jewish War. Martin Goodman wrote a book about the Jewish War and its place in history, and he also wrote Rome and Jerusalem. Another couple of books were from Text to Tradition by Lawrence Schiffman and Discovering Temple Literature by Marcus Simkovich. There was a book by Phil Carradine on Masada, Tacitus's Histories, and last but not least, one volume of the Talmud with the tractate Midot, which, as Cyril mentioned, was often given to bridegrooms. Well, this is part of a set that was given to my father-in-law when he and my mother-in-law became engaged. And that is that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. A masterly exposition, if I may say so. Do we have any questions or comments anybody wants to make?
Yes.
Everybody reeling under there.
I've got one. It's Lee.
Yes, I can see you waving. Yes.
Right. It is actually Flavius Josephus. Is actually available for download on a phone or tablet. completely. All the works.
Yeah.
There, all the Jews and the Antiquities of the Jews, all there. I've got it all in front of me. Just thought if
Okay.
anyone wants to know, it is available very easily. And super talk, Ruth. Thank you.
And
Thank
you're
you.
working your way through it.
Which translation? William Whiston.
It doesn't say where it's from. It just has
Yeah.
the translation.
Yeah.
But it's a free app, so it's a price that I like. So there we are.
Well, if it's free, any other contributions? Okay, well, let's. Oh yes, I can hear an.
That was me. I was thinking about somebody I've got to get in touch with before a shul up the road closes down or moves to another premises, because they have a book of Josephus in Greek or Latin. I'm not sure which, and it's in the shul for safekeeping. Well, it might not be there for much longer.
Okay. Ruth probably read it, so you can read it. Okay. On which note, I just want to say a big thank you to Cyril and to Ruth for two really, really great presentations this evening. Much appreciated and much value. Thank you so much. I can see, we can all see the amount of effort that's gone into all of that. And it's really, as far as I'm concerned anyway, repaid this evening. Thank you so much for that. Next week, we're going to look into the world of fiction. We're going to look at the stories of Tevi the Milchiga, the stories of Tevi the Milkman, as Shalom Aleichem wrote them. And it'd be interesting to compare those with everybody else's image, everybody's favorite milkman, whether it's Topol or whoever else it is who's played Tevye. And we can look at that. And then we're going to move on to Priscilla's presentation about Israel Zangwill. Israel Zangwill, yet another JFS boy made good, who wrote largely towards the end of the 19th century in a variety of ways, all sorts of things. So we look forward to that next week. And once again, a big thank you to Ruth and to Cyril for this week. At which point, Maurice, I don't know if you want to carry on recording or we're just